Dear Lord, we gather here today, not as we would like, but we are together nonetheless. We want our eyes open to the reality of other people, to hear what they are not able to articulate. We want to see justice run like a river, bringing healing and peace to the nations. We want the eyes of our hearts to see the grace of God that is present in every child, woman, and man we meet. We want to be able to see differently, to think differently, to live kindly, to walk humbly, to serve graciously and gratefully. Come, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Pam and I are just shaking this up a little bit here. I'm going to start by reading the Psalm, and then Pam will be telling the story of Genesis. So we decided not to read that, just to let her tell the story. So while everybody is still on mute, Dennis and I are going to read the Psalm responsively, and I asked to share my screen so that if you want to read silently or aloud in your own homes along with us, you can maybe feel like you're participating a little more than Zoom usually allows us to. So Psalm 67. May God be merciful to us and bless us.
Show us the light of his countenance and come to us.
Let your ways be known upon earth.
Your saving health among all nations.
Let the peoples praise you, O God.
Let all the peoples praise you.
Let the nations be glad and sing for joy.
For you judge the people with equity and guide all the nations upon earth.
Let the peoples praise you, O God.
Let all the people praise you.
The earth has brought forth her increase.
May God, our own God, give us his blessing.
May God give us his blessing.
And may all the ends of the earth stand in awe.
As Claudia mentioned, our story is from Genesis, and it is the story of Joseph. And if this story was put into a movie, it would be an incredible saga, just like the Moses story. And it would be the prequel to the Moses story. The history of Jacob and his son Joseph and his other sons set the stage for the enslavement of the Hebrew people in Egypt. And today, I would like to just share a very shortened version of the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. And I'd like to look at the beginning of the story, because our reading actually is from chapter 45, which is pretty much at the end of the story. So in this first picture, you can see Joseph. He's in the middle there with his, the fish is actually representative of his imagination, and he's very much in his head. The two top adoring parents are Rachel and Jacob. And Rachel was Jacob's second wife, and the wife that was of his heart. It was a union of love, as opposed to just his other wives, which were more convenient. His brothers are on the bottom corner there, and I just want to start the story by saying that Joseph was kind of a sibling's worst nightmare. He had the good looks of his mother, Rachel. He was born in Jacob's old age, and so he was a favorite of Jacob's. And he was adored by Jacob, and Jacob would spend many hours with Joseph in training him and educating him. He was the 11th of 12 sons, and as you can imagine, the other 11 sons were a bit put out by a lot of this favoritism. And Jacob didn't make it any better by having a coat of many colors constructed just for Joseph. Back in that time in history, just the dye of red and purple were so expensive that only people of lots of means would ever use that dye. And here he is in a colorful coat, and all his other brothers are given the very message from Jacob that, yep, Joseph is my chosen and Joseph is my favorite. So pile on top of that, Jacob would be sent out into, Joseph would be sent out into the fields to kind of check up on his brothers. And I don't know if it was because his brothers were coarse or if his brothers actually weren't doing the job that they were supposed to do, but he would come home and he would tell his father Jacob stories about how badly they were doing their job. So not only was he the favorite, but he was a tattletale. So he was just, he probably was not easy to live with. So if you want to go on to the next picture. So here we have Jacob, and in this picture, Jacob had a very, he used to dream, and he would dream vivid dreams, and the tensions between him and his brothers, of course, were mounting, and to add on to that tension, he told them about the dreams that he had. And one of the dreams that he had was that they were out harvesting in the wheat fields. And back in those days, you would gather up bundles of wheat and then you would tie it and it would be called a sheaf. And he dreamed that his sheep would stand up straight and his brothers would bow down to his. Now his brothers, of course, heard that and they sneered at him and they said, "Do you think we're going to be ruled by you?" And then he shared another dream. And in that dream, both his brothers and his father Jacob heard him tell them the dream. And it was that the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. And in this dream, even his adoring father Jacob was angry at him for saying that the whole family would be ruled by him. So go on to the next picture, please. So one day, soon after he had shared these dreams with his brothers, Jacob sent Joseph out into the fields to see what his brothers were up to just check on them, to make sure that they were doing okay, that nothing bad had happened to them. And as he's searching the fields and looking for his brothers, they, from far off, can see that it is Joseph approaching them. His beautiful coat is just unmistakable. And they start to talk amongst themselves, you know, let's set the dogs upon him. And soon they're joking, their kind of dark joking turns into a plan to conspire to kill Joseph. And the oldest brother, Reuben, he says, no, we can't. But he does allow them to decide to throw him into a pit. And here you have a picture of Joseph being thrown into the pit by his brothers. And their idea was to leave him there. And then their hands wouldn't have been dirtied by directly killing him. But of course, they would have left him there. And before they threw him into the pit, they had stripped him of his jacket, of his coat, his multicolored coat. And Reuben actually had it in his head that he would allow his brother to sit in the pit for a while. He'd go off and do some of his job that he needed to do with tending to the sheep. And then he'd come back and he'd rescue his brother and kind of calm things over. Well, when Reuben came back from tending, the sheep, doing whatever he needed to do, his brother was gone. And he had found that his other brothers had sold Joseph to a passing caravan that was heading to Egypt to sell their wares. And they sold Joseph to them to be sold as a slave in Egypt. And so you can go on to the next picture. In order to cover up for their misdeeds, the brothers took the coat from Joseph and they ripped it and they dipped it in blood that they had from a goat that they had slaughtered, and they brought it to Jacob. And they let Jacob think that Joseph had been attacked by a wild animal out in the fields, and Jacob just mourned the loss of his favorite son. For years he mourned and he mourned for the loss. Meanwhile, Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. He was sold to a high-ranking official of Pharaoh named Potiphar, and Potiphar quickly came to trust Joseph and saw in Joseph someone who had many talents, and he saw that what it says directly in the Bible, that he saw that God was with him, and that everything that Joseph seemed to touch was successful. And so Potiphar kept giving him more and more responsibilities, but that was not to last, because Potiphar's one of his wives, falsely accused Joseph of assaulting her. And so Potiphar had no option but to throw Joseph into jail. So while he's in jail, Joseph again seems to be favored by God. The jailer sees the potential in Joseph and gives him many responsibilities in taking care of the prisoners. And the prisoners start to trust him, and they start to come to him with their dreams. And he gets the reputation of somebody who can interpret dreams. And this is a picture of one of the baker to the Pharaoh came to him with his dream. And the dream is interpreted by Joseph as that the baker will lose his life. And it happened that he did lose his life. He also told he interpreted another dream, the cupbearer, for Pharaoh. And in that dream, the cupbearer finds favor again with Pharaoh and is returned back to Pharaoh. But it is 2 more years before he's let out of prison. So he's total 12 years in prison, which I think is a pretty amazing amount of time. Anyway, one night, Pharaoh dreams that he's standing by the Nile, and out of the Nile come 7 fat, sleek cows, and they walk to the grasses along the bank of the Nile, and they start to feed on those grasses. Then out of the Nile again come 7 cows where their ribs are showing, their bones are practically protruding out from the skin, and they too walk to the grasses along the bank of the Nile. And they stand there for a while, and then they eat the fat, healthy cattle. But once they've eaten those cattle, you can't tell that they've eaten anything. They look just as gaunt and as sickly as they did before. So Pharaoh wakes up out of this dream, and he's very disturbed by it. And then he goes back to sleep, and he's woken again by another dream. And in this dream, there's a stalk of corn that has 7 ears of corn on it. And in the first stalk of corn, the ears of corn are fat, and they're just filled, and they're beautiful ears of corn. And then another stalk of corn grows up beside it, and they are withered, and they're sickly, and they're not filled out, the kernels aren't filled out. And as the dream goes on, the sickly corn eats the fat corn. Well, Pharaoh the next morning calls his magicians, he calls his wise people, he calls everyone wanting to interpret this dream. And no one can give him a proper interpretation, nothing that feels correct to him. And so it is then that the cupbearer, the one who had been in prison with Joseph, remembers that Joseph himself was able to interpret the dream that he had. I don't know if you can hear my chickens, I apologize. Pharaoh then sends for Joseph, and Joseph interprets his dream. Pharaoh says to him, I hear that you speak the language of dreams. And Joseph says that, no, it is God who speaks through me. I only am the mouthpiece for God. God is the one who interprets the dreams. And then Pharaoh goes on to tell him about the cows and about the corn. And after hearing the dreams, Joseph tells Pharaoh that the dreams stand for a time of great plenty, where the land will be filled with good harvests for 7 years. And then after that, there will be 7 years of famine. The famine will be so severe, he says, that it will swallow up the plenty, as if there had never been any plenty. So Pharaoh is impressed with Joseph, and he puts him in charge of planning for the famine. And he is put into a position where he is second only to Pharaoh. He's got an immense amount of power. And in those 7 years leading up to the famine, every single day, Egyptians are putting away food and storing food. And so when the 7 years come, they have silos just filled with grain and food, plenty. So picture the next picture, please. So Jacob, of course, and all the countries around Egypt hear that Egypt has corn. They hear that there is plenty in Egypt. And Jacob gathers his sons around him, and he sends all but Benjamin, his youngest son, his youngest son from Rachel. He sends the 10 of them to Egypt in order to buy corn. Now, Joseph has been watching for his brothers. He has everyone who comes into Egypt to buy corn write down their name, the name of their father, the names of their grandfathers, so that he will recognize them when they come. And there they are. 2 years into the famine, he sees their names, and he has them arrested. He has them all brought to him, and he starts to question them, and he sees them bowing down in front of them, but there's only 10. And he realizes that in the dream, there were 11. And he starts to question them very harshly. And he says, is this it? Do you have any other brothers? And they say, yes, there were 12 of us. And that one is at home still with his father, and one was lost. And he starts to accuse them of being spies. And he says to them, I don't trust you. And the way that you can earn my trust is by leaving one of you here, and I'm going to send the rest of you back, and you bring back your youngest brother. And then maybe I'll trust that you are not a spy. And so that's what he did. He kept Simeon, put him into jail. The others, he gave plenty of corn, and he gave them provisions to go back. They went back, and it took a lot of convincing to get Jacob to let his youngest, the youngest from Rachel, the wife of his heart. He had no other sons from Rachel besides Joseph and Benjamin, and he didn't want to give up Benjamin, but they convinced him. And so they brought Benjamin back with them, and Joseph still didn't reveal himself. He brought them in, and he gave them food. They had a big banquet. They celebrated that they all were there. And then he had his steward give them plenty of grain and put as much on their horses and their donkeys as they could manage. And he put into the grain sack of his brother Benjamin his favorite goblets. And then he sent his brothers on their way. Well, not long after he sent them, he sent his steward out after them. And his steward accused them of stealing the goblets. And here's the picture of them accusing the brothers of stealing the goblet. And the brothers said, no, we didn't do that. We didn't. And Joseph brought all the brothers back, and he was trying to see if they were still loyal to their father, if they felt anything about giving him up as a slave in Egypt. And they didn't know that he could speak their language. And amongst themselves, they started talking about how this was retribution for what they had done to Joseph. And they told Joseph that he could keep one of them and enslave one of them, but they could not keep their brother Benjamin because it would break their father's heart. And it was then that Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. And that brings us to our reading today. And it says that Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord to all his house, and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks and your herds and all that you have. I will provide for you here, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of your brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. So, in order to make this a sermon, I have to tell you things I think about this story. And I would love to, so you can actually get out of this the pictures. So some of the things that strike me about this story, and what struck me immediately as I was just reading through this whole story, this saga, was the presence of God throughout, and the choice of leaning in towards God. So Joseph is enslaved by his brother's actions, his brothers selling him into Egypt. And the story, when you read it from the beginning all the way to the end, by the way, this isn't really the total end. You know, this is kind of the climactic end, but there's more to this story if you want to go back and look at it. The Bible really spends no time of Joseph being resentful or hateful towards his brothers. He makes the choice to be with God. And so even like when he's when he's first sold to Potiphar, Potiphar sees God within him, and he starts to elevate Joseph. When he is accused by Potiphar's wife of assaulting her, it's actually her that he's turning against. She's the one who wanted to have a relationship with him, and because of his relationship with God, he says no to her. He's put in jail and in prison, and he's there for 12 years. But not one line in the Bible talks about him spending any of his energy towards hatred towards his brothers. And then finally, when he's reunited with his brothers, he tells them that God has used them and used him in order to extend the life of their family, in order to save Jacob's line, and that it was God's doing. So when I was discussing this with Claudia, one of the things that both of us talked about was that we both don't like the idea of God having, people be like little marionettes, and that we as humans have been given free will. But in this story, there's always this turning and looking towards God as opposed to looking away from God, and that God then was able to use all of the players in order to save Jacob's line. And we all have that same choice. We all have that choice to lean towards God or to lean away from God. And as I was talking with Claudia about this, when you think about 7 years of famine, it's like 7 years of COVID. It's got to be, that must have been a horrendous time in Egypt, to think about how to take care of your people when your land is barren and you have no way to really to support them. And same here with COVID. I mean, we have resources, we have things, and we can hold people up. We can turn towards God and really use those resources to hold each other up, or we can make the other decision to turn away from God. And I think in some ways this historic story kind of mirrors our own conflict right now, and we can make choices just as they had to make choices at that time. The other thing that I came across was an idea from a Jewish scholar named Joseph Jacobson, and he was questioning why Pharaoh thought that his interpretation of Pharaoh's dream was so brilliant. Because in some ways, when you think about it, well, and maybe hindsight is clear, but anyway, it seems like a fairly easy, dream to interpret in some ways. The 7, fat years, 7 years of famine. But in Jacobson's idea is that what the magicians and the Pharaoh's people who advised him, what they missed was that there was a possibility of both having famine and plenty both at the same time, and that they could coexist at the same time. And that Joseph saw that during the years of plenty, that Egypt must live with the years of famine as well, as though they were already present. Even while enjoying the abundance of the years of plenty, Egypt must experience in its imagination the reality of the upcoming famine, and that each day it must store food away. So keeping those two realities in sight, in your head. And Jacobson reflects that the Bibles of the story are not only like details of historical events, but they're also they're metaphysical and timeless tales that occur continuously within the human heart, and that the idea of that we also experience within our hearts and within in our lives times of plenty and times of famine, and that he feels that the story of the dream is that during times of plenty, when we're successful, when we're comfortable, our jobs are going well, things are just skipping along, that it's often a time when we feel very self-sufficient and we don't take the time to cultivate emotional intimacy, and we don't take the time to deepen the relationships that we have with friends, and especially we don't take the time to deepen our relationship with God. And then all of a sudden, when what happens with us all, that we have times of famine or hardship, suddenly we're reaching out beyond ourselves. We want to connect with others, and we want to connect with God. But because we haven't taken the time and the work to nurture our relationships and our spirituality during the times of plenty, that we don't know how to do it. And he contends that the wisdom of Joseph is that you never detach the years of plenty from the years of famine. That when you experience plenty, he says, don't let it blind your vision and desensitize you from what is truly important in life. The priorities you cultivate during your good times should be the kind that will sustain you during your bad times as well. And I just really like that idea because I think it's really true that often or I should say, I feel very self-sufficient. Things are, going right along. I don't need other people. And I think that's kind of American culture too, in some respects. But this story is a good reminder that we need to take those times to deepen our relationships, to deepen our understanding of God and how God plays such an important part in our lives. So those are the thoughts that I've had. If anybody would like to add anything that they got from this story, I would love anybody's ideas or comments or whatever.
Go ahead and unmute yourself if you do.
Pam, I appreciate it, and I told you this when we discussed it during the week. I don't usually participate in Bible study, but I did this week. I kind of ran it since David was gone. I did the Zoom part of it, but I know we were struggling with all the questions about, well, what about this and what about this? And so you've really put it together for me. So I really appreciate that, having the bigger picture.
Thanks. There's actually so many details that I had to leave out because it's just a huge story. So seriously, go back and read it in the Bible. It's quite detailed.
Pam, I want to thank you too. I thought that was tremendous. And the messaging at the end about isolating in the times when everything is fine and not finding the community that you need really resonates with me. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I just want to thank you for the chickens in the background. It reminded me of my upbringing back in Kansas.
They've been especially loud today. I don't know why.
Were the 7 lean chickens eating the 7 fat chickens?
Yes. We only have 4 though. So one thing we did talk about, Claudia, which I didn't throw in here, but I think I want to throw it in. So when Claudia and I were talking about this story, we talked about how like the people from countries outside of Egypt and even Egyptians themselves would come to the Pharaoh or would come to Joseph, and they would buy corn. Then once they ran out of money, they gave the Pharaoh their livestock to buy food. Then once they ran out of livestock, they gave the Pharaoh their land. Then once they ran out of land, then the Pharaoh enslaved them. And one of the sources that I read said that this was because of this enslavement, because right out of this story comes the Moses story, and that because of the enslavement of the Egyptians, that the enslavement of the Hebrews was soon on the heels of that. So Claudia and I talked about, what Joseph was like as a person, and maybe this part of him is not as godly as he could have been, and maybe we have some lessons to learn from this part of the story too, where the way we support each other during hard times, if we're taking everything from people and not, you know, being generous with those things that we have, that the trauma of that history will come to haunt us. And I think that's something that repeats itself too. Anyway, that's all I have. So.